Welcome to the Experts in Sport podcast, brought to you by the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences at Loughborough University. This podcast seeks to bring together the worlds of academia and professional practice. If you're interested in the latest research and trends in sport and want to hear from experts from around the world, then subscribe now, because this is the podcast for you. I'm your host, Martin Foster, Applied Sport Management Lead at Loughborough University.
Today, we're with Borja Garcia, Senior Lecturer in Sport Management at Loughborough University. Borja is an expert in the European Union, politics and governance in sport. Today we're going to hear from Borja and his thoughts on how Brexit could impact the Premier League and change football forever. How are you, Borja?
I'm fine, thank you. Thanks for having me.
That's okay. Did you have a safe trip getting here?
Oh yes, I'm just coming from the office next door, so it wasn't that difficult, really.
Good, I'm glad you didn't get lost. For our listeners who are repeat listeners, you may be aware that we've also interviewed Joe Piggin, who is the other side of next door. They don't live in the same office, so in the future we might go slightly further afield. Okay, Borja. Today we're going to talk about Brexit and how Brexit could destroy the Premier League. But before we get to it, we need to understand Brexit and what could happen. So we're going to talk about freedom of movement when the UK leaves and what the law says about this. So can you shed some light on that?
Let's try, because of course the first thing we need to say about Brexit is that we really don't know much. There is not an agreement signed, and of course nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. It's very difficult to know what the relationship of the United Kingdom with the European Union is going to be. So it's difficult because we don't know basically how Brexit is going to look like. But we may try to make some guesses and some discussions about what actually Brexit may entail in general and may entail for football and for the Premier League in particular. So of course, if the United Kingdom leaves the European Union, what is going to mean is that they are going to leave the single market. That is quite clear. The United Kingdom also will leave the customs union, although may end up in a sort of new customs union, particularly tailored for the UK. That's the latest talk in the press. And then we'll leave all the institutions. I think the important here, we need to focus especially in what leaving the single market will mean for the UK. So basically, freedom of movement will end. So let's remember, freedom of movement of workers, of capitals, and freedom to provide services across Europe will mean. So that means that, of course, British people involved in football, players, coaches, physios, will not be able to go and work freely in Europe. But similarly, of course, players, physios, coaches will not be able to come to the United Kingdom to work freely in the area of football.
So are we saying that all the footballers in the Premiership that are foreign can't play anymore?
Well, it's more complicated than that. It's more complicated, and it's actually quite complicated. Let's see, at the moment we have, let's say, three types of footballers playing in the Premier League. We have British players, who no problem at all. Then we have European players or EU players, plus the Norway and Switzerland, but let's call it them European players, who now are able to play also freely. And then we have non-European players who are subject to a work permit. They are subject to immigration. In theory, European players will stop being free and will have to be subject to immigration. So to any sort of immigration policy that either the government or the football association decides to apply. However, there is one problem there, which is, let's remember that this government has committed that any European national who is currently living and working legally in the United Kingdom before Brexit Day will be allowed to stay. So actually, any football player, let's say N'Golo Kanté, who has a French passport and plays for Chelsea, he's now playing. He's playing under a French passport, but because he's been living in this country for now 3-4 years, he's legally employed, he actually should be allowed to stay. But the same could apply to any player that any club signs in the next transfer window in January.
So it could be a big transfer window of foreign players?
Of European players, indeed, because according to what has been agreed between the EU and the UK. And importantly, that agreement is not only just part of the withdrawal agreement of the EU and the UK, it's also part of the legislation that Parliament has already passed. So even in the event of no deal, theoretically, any person, any European citizen who is already living in Britain before March next year should be allowed to stay and to work. So as you say, any club signs any European player in the next January transfer window. In theory, even in the event of no deal, those players should be allowed actually to stay and to play in the Premier League, even if they do not meet the criteria of the work permit that may be established afterwards.
Okay, so that work permit established afterwards, let's pretend it's happened.
Yeah.
It's happened now, and we're looking at skilled workers being footballers. What is that criteria?
At the moment, I think we need to follow, or at least to discuss what is the actual criteria that is applied to non-European workers, which is, if I am correct, I mean, there are tables, but basically those players need to have played a number of games for their national team in their own country, according to their age. It's around normally, ballpark figure, it's 75% of the games. So let's say, if you want to sign a player from Brazil, which is not Europe, of course, that player needs to have been in the national team squad for at least around 75% of the games that Brazil has played in a number of years. There are tables that really depends of the age of the player.
Does this count for under 21s, under 18s and below, or is it just senior games?
As far as I understand, it counts for senior games. Indeed, it counts for senior games. There are some differences there, that it also depends of how powerful the country is, also basically how high the country is in FIFA rankings.
Yeah.
So for example, it's not the same for a Brazilian in this case that someone from, let's say, Angola, or even Iran. Nottingham Forest has recently signed an Iranian international striker.
Yep.
So of course, because Iran is not so high in the.
Should we let the listeners know that the Nottingham Forest, that's not just a random comment. Me and Borja are both Nottingham Forest fans, so if you want to join us, then become a Forest fan.
Our listeners should become Forest fans, actually.
Yeah,
I think
agreed,
so.
Agreed. Sorry for that.
But as I said, depending on the country, it also depends, and I think it also depends of the age, because of course you cannot ask for a younger player to have played a lot of games with their national team. So there is a committee. There is a committee that meets in the FA to decide these cases, and actually, football clubs normally what they do, they present individual cases. If even football clubs can make individual cases for players who, in theory, do not qualify in the letter of the law, in those tables, in those numerical criteria. Sometimes that committee accepts it, some other times that committee doesn't accept it. So it's really about what we need to see is which type of work permit will be implemented, will be designed for European players who arrive to the United Kingdom beyond the implementation period. And that's also important. Let's remember that, again, in theory, according to the agreement between the European Union and the United Kingdom, there is going to be an implementation period, an extension period. So actually, we may well be looking at around 2021 as a cutoff period instead of 2019.
So with what you're saying, we're basically saying that we would still be able to sign top international players with lots of caps. Shouldn't be a problem signing them because they're skilled workers.
Yes, that's basically it. Yeah, if we follow the criteria for non-European players, in theory, yeah. I mean that it's logic to think that still top, good quality, skilled players, skilled workers will still be allowed to work in the United Kingdom.
So
the other question, if I may add, is that of course we are talking about the work permit, but what about the quota? Is the Football Association going to establish any quotas like in the past? At the moment, no. At the moment, if your players are skilled, even if they come from Brazil, you can bring 11 Brazilian players if they comply with the work permit regulations. But some countries actually put a quota to that. So Is the Football Association going to establish a quota of European players, even if they are skilled? That's a debate to be had. I don't think they will, but could happen.
So, we've established that top players can still come, but what about potentially top players, those with potential, or players that haven't got the caps but currently may be playing in the Premiership? We're potentially saying that those players we won't be able to sign.
In theory, yes, we won't be able to do it for two reasons. One, because they may not be skilled enough, so they won't qualify for a work permit, unless, of course, the system is created again in a way in which the requirements for young players are less than for more experienced players. But, of course, politically, that could be difficult because, of course, people will say, well, you are actually hampering our own young English players to develop. So it is politically very sensitive. And second, because there is a FIFA regulation, which is not very well known, but international transfers are governed by FIFA, and international transfers cannot happen for under 18 players. So, a player from anywhere in the world, Brazil, Argentina, cannot actually transfer to another country before they are over 18. However, in Europe, that rule is only for players who are under 16. So there is a two-age bracket, players between 16 and 18, where with Brexit, clubs will not be able to sign them anymore. And that's also interesting. Although, of course, those players will never be very, very skilled. They will be in training will be very, very young. But certainly, academies of English or Scottish or Northern Irish clubs, on the one hand, will probably have difficulties in recruiting players, let's say in early career, 18, 19, 20 years old, because perhaps they may not be skilled enough, may not have played enough for their national team. And moreover, they will not be able to sign, in theory at all, players between 16 and 18 because they don't fall under FIFA regulations. So, for example, a player such as Cesc Fabregas, who joined Arsenal when he was 16 and a half, he won't be able to come to England anymore.
So there'll be a lot of people that would say, actually, for English players, Brexit could be a great thing because potentially it shows that more English players may be playing in the Premiership, and certainly from what you said there, more English players will be in English academies and therefore develop potentially into players that play in the Premiership. So there is a lot of people who would say, actually, this is a really good thing.
Indeed. I think this can be seen in this way. There, in theory, if you reduce the pool of foreign talent, that will open more opportunities for local, homegrown talent. I think the PFA, the Professional Footballers Association, has said that already, and that is indeed the case. Let's remember that England is one of the countries, European footballing countries, where more foreign players are actually hired and play. I think it's in terms of percentage, only around a little bit more than a third of the players playing in the Premier League are homegrown. So actually, if you compare it with how many homegrown players are in other big leagues such as Germany, the Bundesliga or La Liga in Spain, certainly the Premier League, it lags behind. So there is a lot of space to cover to provide opportunities for English players. Just as a ballpark figure, if we currently, at this very moment, were to apply the work permit test to current European players in the Premier League, around 350 will not qualify. 350 will not qualify.
That's a big number.
It's a big number. So English clubs, Premier League club. I think that's not only Premier League and English Football League. So the top four divisions, the professional game in England, clubs will lose around 350 players. Although, of course, because those players are currently living, working. They actually, in theory, and in appliance of the law and the agreement, that they should not lose their...
But in the future,
indeed,
that's the element. There's those 350 players that take up that part of the league, and therefore, as we look to sign new players, there's those. If it stays the same, those 350 players will be replaced potentially by English players.
Exactly, and if we say 350 players out of the 92 professional football clubs in the pyramid, in the professional pyramid in England, that's 3 point something between 3 and 4 per club. 3 and 4 may not look like a big number, but let's remember 3 and 4 it's a third, between a third and a quarter of the squad of the lineup. And if we say a squad is normally of 25 players, it's a fifth of the squad. So I mean, it's a significant number that could go for English players. However, the question is, will English clubs have enough coaches scouting instructors to identify that young talent and to bring it up first time?
I know you've got a statistic on this. So do you want to give the statistic regarding coaches? Because I think we've heard this before, that coaching in the UK lacks behind the foreign market. So what are the numbers on that? How many coaches do we have in comparison to the other top leagues?
That is an important problem. That is going to be an important problem, and one that may be exacerbated by Brexit, and one that some clubs have actually started to realize. So, for example, Brighton and Hove Albion recently hired Dan Ashworth, the technical director of the FA, and one of the reasons why they actually hired Dan Ashworth was Brexit. The chief executive officer of Brighton and Hove Albion said, well, we've been looking at Brexit. We think we'll have to up our game in identifying young talent. We've tried to get someone who we think is good at that. And that was Dan Ashworth. So that tells you that British or English clubs in this case, and in this case Brighton, which is a very well-managed club, know there might be a problem there. No, they don't have enough professionals to do that. And that is backed by the numbers, which is what you asked me. England has traditionally had a shortage of well-qualified coaches. We need to measure somehow, we need to get numbers somehow, and in that, what we do is to see the number of coaches that have followed what they call the official batches. The official batches, the coaching courses that are endorsed by UEFA. Those are normally called UEFA A, B, and Pro license. So 3 categories. In England, you only have 2,669 English coaches that have UEFA badges. So basically under 3,000 coaches with UEFA badges, whereas in Spain, let's remember, Spain is a country of half of the population of the United Kingdom. Of course, England is not the whole United Kingdom, but England is 85% of the United Kingdom, so still Spain is around 2/3 smaller than England. Spain has, however, almost 24,000 qualified players, so we are talking 3,000 against 24,000 in Spain. Italy has almost 30,000 qualified coaches, and Germany, which is a country of similar size of the UK, they have almost 35,000 qualified coaches. So you can say it's not a small difference, it's a lot. Germany has almost 10 times as many qualified coaches as England has. Spain has, at least around 20,000 more qualified coaches for less population. And I think these numbers are even understood better if we see the number of coaches per players registered. To be a player you need to register with your club, with your FA and all that. So in England there are around 2.25 million registered players, So that basically means that there is one UEFA qualified coach for each 812 players. So almost 1 to 1,000 is the ratio. 1 to 800, 1 to 800. Whereas the ratio in Spain is 1 to 17. So 1 to 800 and 1 to 17. The ratio in Germany is 1 to 96. So that's really
a huge difference.
There is a huge difference, and the question would therefore, there will be, of course, a number of very well qualified coaches working at the top in the professional clubs, and probably even up to League Two. But you really need to identify early the talent, and that's where those qualified coaches that are employed in lower clubs are important, and that's where those well qualified coaches that have to teach those young players at, let's say, high school, secondary age are important. Because yes, of course, Manchester United, of course, Nottingham Forest is going to have a good number of well-qualified players. Of course, they are professional at the top of the pyramid, but you need to go to look down, and then they need to progress to those clubs. And that this shortage of coaches then is compounded by the fact that will all those clubs be able to employ coaches from Europe?
Yeah.
So are any, like in the NHS, a lot of the NHS is bringing a lot of nurses, well-qualified nurses from Spain, from Poland, from Italy. Will football, and now many of those are leaving, and we don't know whether the NHS will be able to actually get those qualified nurses. This is the same case. Okay, there is a pool of well-qualified coaches outside England, but will they be able to come and work in England? It's the same. It's the same as for players.
So what we're saying potentially then is that there may be an increase in the amount of players from England that can play, but the development of talent from coaches, and I'd probably add into that from players as well further down the league, the influence that foreign players have on English players as well as coaches will be reduced, and therefore the quality of the English players that are developing will be reduced.
I think so. There is a potential risk of that.
That's the potential we're
because
talking about,
at the end of the day, let's remember we are talking here about, okay, when they are young players, young athletes developing, but we are talking here about athletes that are aiming to develop towards the top of their game. And you and I are not a specialist in coaching, but we are well versed in professional sport, and I think we both will agree that competition makes better athletes. You know,
yeah,
so you need to compete with the best to get to your best, and even being exposed to new ideas. I think now it is well accepted that new methods brought by Arsene Wenger back in the 80s and 90s made Arsenal and even English football different. And now I've read everywhere all the praises as to how Pep Guardiola's methods are improving not just Manchester United, but some even I read
Manchester City,
sorry. Yes, exactly. But I read even some people speculating whether this new Pep Guardiola style may have even influenced the success of England in Russia in the World Cup. I'm not sure I agree with that because England played a very different football style than Pep Guardiola's Manchester City. But in any case, what I'm trying to say is that it is important for English players, of course, to have more opportunities and to have more players, but it is equally important for them to develop their game, to be training and playing with the best, and that will, and dare I to say that even as, again, not someone who is a specialist in coaching or in football development, I'm a specialist in other areas, but yes, who has observed a lot of English football, it is even important to try and change the mentality of English football. I've seen a lot of grassroots football in England, in this country, where the mentality of the players and the mentality of those watching is the game is basically kick it long, you know, and that's sort of the only acceptable way to play football.
I think that has changed a lot. I think that has changed. I suppose it depends on what level you're watching. If you look in young grassroots level, I certainly think that there has been a step change from the FA and from coaches in terms of how to play. I suppose that probably is a podcast for others here to talk about the actual coaching side of things and the improvement in coaching. But what we're saying is that Brexit will cause less foreign coaches to be here, less foreign players, and therefore if we're looking at things from a global standpoint, and the Premier League being the pinnacle of football in the world, we're basically saying that this will reduce the quality of the Premier League.
It has the potential to reduce the quality of the Premier League in terms of the football that is played, because it will less the potential to attract foreign talent. So I think it has the potential to do that, yes.
Okay, so let's talk about that. The Premiership in decline. And I think, what did I have the title of this? How Brexit could destroy the Premier League. Okay, so we've established, if these things go ahead, there's less foreign players, less foreign coaches, and we're suggesting a reduction in the talent pool, both coaching and players, and therefore the Premiership's quality is reduced. That's our presumption at the moment. So now we're assuming that, what would you be doing as a club? Also, first of all, what would happen to the Premier League if the quality is reduced? What, as a product?
Well, let's remember the Premier League at the moment is the richest and best football league in Europe, well, in the world, really. So it's the gold standard for perhaps, I don't know if football played on the pitch, because that's very much to individual taste. Some people would prefer Spanish football, some people would prefer Italian football, but as a product is the best, no doubt about it. If your customers, your fans, the people who watch your games, who buy your tickets, who buy your television subscriptions, perceive a reduction in the quality of the product, because it's about perception. Let's remember, it's about perception. It may well reduce the quality, but actually people don't perceive it or people don't care about it. But there is a risk that the perception of less quality reduces, therefore your income reduces. Therefore, you lose, on the one hand, competitive advantage, especially with your main rivals elsewhere in Europe, really, La Liga, Paris Saint-Germain, Bayern Munich, and all those others. So who knows whether perhaps we may also extrapolate that to think that English clubs may do even worse in European competitions, which could well be a consequence. But that's more of a sporting consequence. In terms of the Premier League economically, basically it may well be that there is a reduction of income. And when there is a reduction of income, that basically means that clubs will need either, again, to restructure their squads, so to have less players, to pay less to their players. So again, that will reduce how attractive the Premier League is for foreign players. So all in all, what we are saying basically is that it will be a less attractive product, and therefore it will be more difficult for the teams to compete. Of course, at national level, if all the clubs are more or less in the same footing, so the Premier League in the national competition, more or less it will be the same. Then it will depend, of course, of whether fans like or don't like the quality of the football, and it is likely that at the end of the day that is not going to be reduced that much. However, I think we need to look at one extra point, which is whether the possible decrease on quality of the Premier League will then also add up to a much highly likely economic crisis induced by Brexit in general in the United Kingdom. Most specialists tell you that there is likely to be at least about 10 years of economic crisis and recession in this country. Then, who knows, in 25-30 years things will be better, but sort of the first 10 years could be difficult. And if you are a football fan, or you are just a family person, and you start feeling the economic squeeze of Brexit, what would you do? Will you keep your season ticket? Will you keep your Sky or BT Sports subscription? That's where we need to start joining the dots. And I think at the moment, not many people in the football industry are joining the dots of direct impact, but also indirect impact on football. And let's remember that the latest bid for TV rights of the Premier League in the English-British market went down by around 10%. Okay, so of course it's very high.
So already in decline.
It's already in decline. Some people, of course, would say the problem is not that it is declining; is that the previous round was far too high. Mm-hmm. So in that way, it's more of a readjustment. But the reality is that, let's put it very bluntly, the amount of pounds, the amount of money that the Premier League is going to get per televised game for the next 3 years has reduced by 10%.
Okay, so we have established then that the Premier League, if Brexit goes ahead, we're going to have worse players, worse coaches, the product, as a global product, is going to go down. The other leagues are going to attack that as a situation and sign the top players, grow their brand, reduce the income from TV revenues. Potentially, if there's an economic crisis, maybe spectatorship at grounds goes down and merchandise. And essentially, the Premiership is not what it used to be. That's what we're suggesting could happen.
Could happen. Indeed.
Therefore, if you are one of these entities as a part of this product, so you're a club in the Premier League and you have got your crystal ball with us and they've seen this as well, what are you going to do about this as a club? We had this conversation 4 weeks ago, and it just so happens that others have jumped upon this, and Sky have already interviewed you about this last week. Got ahead of me. The Guardian, I've got an article from The Guardian here, and we're talking European Super League.
Exactly. If you're a club, an individual club, and I think here is where we need to start making differentiations between the league and the clubs, and it's where the cracks in the Premier League and even in the English Football League may start to appear. Until now, the Premier League is not only the best football product in the world, it's also an extraordinarily good example of how a league needs to be managed as a whole, as everybody, we are all in this together, like the Americans do.
So shared revenue,
things like that. Shared common branding, all these type of things that the Americans do so well.
We may do another podcast in the future. I'm delivering a lecture on franchising tomorrow, but I think we can touch upon all those things about how you structure a perfect league in another podcast. But they're great things to think about.
Yeah, but what I think is that until now, the Premier League, with some things better than others, some American leagues are doing things better than the Premier League, but in Europe is probably one of the best leagues at that. Now, what we are saying is that cracks may start to appear, or actually cracks have already appeared. That's the thing. So, if you were a club and you were looking for your own individual interest, not the league's interest, but your own individual interest to maintain your revenue, to maintain your profitability, because let's remember that for the first time in Premier League history, in the last 3-4 years, Premier League clubs have been profitable. So for the first time in many, many years, club owners are getting money. Because until now, exactly, until 3 years ago, clubs, the Glazers, any Alisher Usmanov owner or Arsenal, they were not really getting money. Now they are getting money. So if you are a club owner, okay, what can you do? We've already talked about what Brighton and Hove Albion is doing. What we are basically saying is that if you are a top Premier League club, and here we are probably talking the top 6, your traditional top 6, you are likely to have, on the one hand, a possible decrease in revenue. Further to that, you're likely to have a decrease in global audience because you may not be able to hire so many global stars from Europe. So perhaps your income from global markets, your merchandising, internet streams may go down. And if you accept that the real top competition is the Champions League, the European competition, you are likely to have rivals who have perhaps more money, or not money, but they will increase in their income, but also will have better players or more players available to them. So the question the top clubs should be making themselves therefore is, should we still actually play in the Premier League?
See that there has been secret meetings, according to this article in The Guardian, involved from the Premiership, Manchester United, Manchester City, Chelsea, Arsenal and Liverpool already been involved in conversations about a European Super League.
Exactly.
And as we mentioned briefly before, following more a closed league structure like the Americans, so franchising into a league, being part of it and having not been able to face relegation for 20 years, according to this.
Exactly.
Which, as a product, as a club, well, that sounds pretty appealing.
Exactly, because you have income which is completely secure for a number of years, 10, 15, 20 years. You also have a small competition which is probably more marketable, although because it's new, it will need time. But
playing fixtures potentially all over the world.
It could well be.
Talked about Game 39 years ago. Not going to happen. But in this format, you could be playing in India, China, wherever, and be a global team that travels
Indeed,
with their fan bases.
Indeed, it could be quite revolutionary, but that could well be that new European league could decide to play the majority of games, of course, home and away in Europe, but then decide to play a number of games abroad, like the NBA or the NFL does in London now, for example. So that could well happen. The real question is basically how to do that. The way we should come to this issue of the Super League is basically, okay, we have clubs in the Premier League who will see their income reduce, their value reduce. So they need to make up that loss somehow. How can they do it? One is certainly joining a European Super League, a new competition that will give them more money, basically, more money, more value. Now, they can do it by joining that competition exclusively and leaving the national one, or of course, trying to retain their national status and perhaps breaking up with UEFA Champions League and created their rival Champions League to make more money. Then, of course, there we enter into a lot of debates, political debates within football as to whether clubs will be allowed to do that. In basketball, the richest clubs have created the EuroLeague, which now has 16 clubs, 11 of which will play that competition for 10 years, and each year they invite 5 clubs. But those clubs still play their national league. And they are allowed to play the national league.
All clubs still play the national league.
All the EuroLeague clubs, all of the clubs in the EuroLeague, they do that. However, basketball players that play in the EuroLeague cannot play, or at least cannot play some of the fixtures of the national team. Because national teams, national federations are actually scheduling fixtures of national team in the same days that EuroLeague
That's very
plays.
interesting.
So let's say basically Manchester City joins a new EuroLeague. EuroLeague plays on a Saturday, and then England and UEFA decide that same Saturday there is England playing Germany. Who could Harry Kane play for? Could he play for Tottenham in the EuroLeague game against Milan, or could Harry Kane play for England against Germany?
Again, that is a brilliant question. I think something that our listeners will really want to think about. And probably a really good thing for looking at that globally in terms of the power, because in some sports the power's with the national governing body and with the national team, but the Premiership's a different beast, and we all know the power's with the clubs in reality. So I think that's a really interesting one we could talk about a lot further. I think you bring an interesting point here, because the articles that I've seen so far all talk about breaking away from their nation, and what we're really talking about is the potential, or what we discussed about a month ago, is the potential for each club to have almost 2 teams, and they have the team that plays nationally and the team that plays globally.
Exactly. If clubs go for, okay, let's create a new Super League but not break with the national team, or actually even if they decide not to break away, let's keep playing the Champions League. Let's say UEFA comes with a new format, UEFA gives the clubs more money. But let's remember that in the Champions League there are no nationality restrictions, okay? So clubs playing in the Champions League, they can play and field any foreign players from Europe, from around the world they want. However, English players might be reduced to do that in their national league. So again, let's say a team such as Arsenal or Manchester United, then they will have, if they want to compete in the Premier League, in the National League, they will have to follow those new rules we've been discussing before. So they may not be able to employ European players. However, if they are going to play the Champions League, that is not the case. So which brings us to question, okay, perhaps a club such as Manchester United or Arsenal or Tottenham who is playing in Europe, they decide, okay, we'll keep a sort of weaker squad for the National League, for the Premier League, because it complies with the new FA and work permit and government Brexit-induced regulations, but we will still have a larger and bigger squad, or even a different squad to play in Europe.
For a global empire.
And this may sound crazy. Okay, how is a club going to have two teams, like A team or B team. However, again, I know this is not a very popular sport in this country, in Britain, but again, we really should look at basketball, because there is one club, Maccabi Tel Aviv, from Israel, who plays the EuroLeague. Israel is in Eurovision, is in UEFA, is also in basketball EuroLeague, and that team was proposing to have two different teams, one for the National League and one for the EuroLeague. So, and Maccabi Tel Aviv is a relatively traditional basketball team. They are not outsiders. They've been European champions a number of times. They are a very traditional basketball team. So what we are seeing here is we are seeing dynamics in which, in this case of Israel, where the national context forces the club to have two different teams for European and national competitions. So that could well happen in England as well.
Which is what Brexit could do, because I would imagine, let's say Manchester United, they could register as a company in Europe, and they could have whatever players they wanted playing that team, and then registered as a club in England and have those restrictions on them, which may lead to them having their global team where they can sign anybody and their national team where they can't, and they're the two things come about. So even though this is a fantasy built up in our heads,
yes, indeed,
let's make that clear, there are some realistic prospects of some of this coming to fruition.
This is a fantasy to a certain extent, but it is a fantasy based on real facts. It's a fantasy based on our analysis of the legal and economic consequences of Brexit for the sports industry and for the wider society.
Borja, I think that's brilliant. I hope our listeners have taken that on board, and they've heard it here first. If Brexit goes ahead as is and as is imagined in our heads, then we could be seeing the decline of the Premiership and the rise of the European Super League. I think that's the message that we're giving to everybody today.
I think that's the message. I think basically is that Brexit certainly increases the chance of the creation of a breakaway Super League, and especially increases the chance of the biggest and richest clubs in both the Premier League, but also the Football League. Also the Football League. We've heard Leeds owner actually to complain a lot about the Football League. So Brexit increases the chances that the cracks start to appear in that structure, and therefore decline may start to appear. Although, of course, as we said at the very beginning, we really cannot say it for sure, because we don't know what the Brexit agreement is going to look like, and of course nothing is agreed until everything is agreed in relation to Brexit.
Perfect, Borja. Borja, thanks very much for your time, and thanks for giving us that very, very clear idea of what could happen from Brexit. And like we said, this may be pie in the sky and nothing really happens, or you may have heard it here first, and this, our crystal ball shows you what's going to happen.
We'll claim it.
We'll take it from there. I just want to thank you all for listening. If you've enjoyed the discussion, or if you have further questions to ask, then Borja, I'm sure they can contact you. Have you got a Twitter handle that they can contact you on?
I do, yes. They can contact me at Dr. Borja Garcia, which is the DR for doctor, and then BORJA and Garcia, like all together, no dashes, no underscores, everything. Garcia is, of course, like Andy Garcia or Sergio Garcia.
They'll find you. They will find you if they want to ask those questions. So any questions about Brexit and any specific questions about this, then please feel free to get in contact with Borja on Twitter. If you want to get in touch and let us know any subject areas or experts that you'd be keen to listen to, then contact me, Martin Foster, on m.foster@loughborough.ac.uk, or tweet me at martinfoster82. Bye for now. We'll see you next time.